My name is Frank Dalton. I'm 68 years old, and I live in Dayton, Ohio. I've spent most of my life working with my hands and trying to keep my word. 38 years at the same manufacturing plant, first on the floor, then as a shift lead, and the last 10 as a maintenance supervisor. I wasn't flashy, never tried to be. I showed up, did my job, and came home to the same woman I'd been coming home to since 1983. Linda and I met at a church picnic. She wore a pale yellow sundress and laughed like she meant it. We were young, broke, and stubborn in the way young people think is strength. We built our life the slow way. One paycheck, one used car, one repainting of a kitchen cabinet at a time. 2 kids, a mortgage we finally paid off, summers at the lake when we could afford them, and the kind of arguments that burn out fast because you've got work in the morning. When I retired 3 years ago, I expected things to soften. I figured we'd settle into a quieter rhythm, maybe travel a little, maybe spend more time with the grandkids. And for a while, we did. Mornings on the porch with coffee, Linda tending her roses, me tinkering in the garage. We weren't perfect, but we were steady. I trusted that steadiness. Then little things started changing. Nothing you could point at in court. Nothing a man wants to admit bothers him. Linda began keeping her phone face down. She'd step into the laundry room to take calls. She put a password on her tablet, which she'd never done before. If I asked what she was smiling at, she'd say, "Oh, just something funny," and turn the screen away. At first, I told myself it was harmless. People are allowed private corners. But the feeling didn't go away. It sat in my chest like a small stone. I'd wake up at night and hear her typing, quick little taps, then the silence when I rolled over. I wasn't jealous by nature. I'd never checked her pockets or followed her car. After 4 decades, you don't go looking for shadows unless something puts them there. I didn't know then how far those shadows went. I only knew my wife was pulling away, and I couldn't name the reason. That's how this story begins. Not with rage, not with certainty, but with a quiet, stubborn question I couldn't quite swallow down. I'm telling you these details because at my age you learn that character matters more than flair. I've made mistakes, sure, but I've never been careless with people's trust. That's why what happened later cut so deep. It wasn't just a surprise. It was a violation of the kind of life we promised each other. And if I sound slow or deliberate, that's because I am. Truth deserves to be walked up to, not rushed by shouting. Linda had always been a creature of habit. Same grocery store on Tuesdays, same hair appointment every 6 weeks, same diner breakfast with her sister on the first Saturday of each month. That's why the shifts stood out to me. It wasn't just one late night. It was a pattern that didn't fit the woman I'd known for most of my life. She started going out more often with the girls. That's what she called them, even though most of her friends were married and just as set in their ways. She'd come home later than usual, cheeks flushed like she'd been laughing hard, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. I'd ask how it went, and she'd give me the skinny version. Nice. We talked. You know how it is. Then she'd head straight to the shower as if she needed to wash the night off. One afternoon I walked into the kitchen and found her snapping a photo of herself in the mirror. Not a silly one. Not for our daughter or the grandkids. She had on a blouse I hadn't seen before and lipstick she didn't usually wear. She jumped when she saw me, like a teenager caught smoking behind the garage. "I'm just trying something new," she said, and laughed too loud. She took up jogging. Linda hadn't jogged since Reagan was in office. Suddenly she was buying new sneakers, talking about steps and heart rates. I told her good for you. I meant it. but I also noticed she'd disappear for 2 hours and come back with her hair still neat, not sweaty, smelling more like perfume than fresh air. I tried to bring it up gently. I asked if something was bothering her, if she felt lonely with me around so much now that I was retired. She said no. She said I was imagining things. Then she'd change the subject, ask if I'd taken the trash out, talk about the neighbor's new fence, anything to move us away from the quiet space between us. That space grew. She stopped reaching for my hand in the grocery store. She didn't sit beside me on the couch anymore, choosing the armchair instead. When we went to bed, she'd turn to her side and fall asleep fast, leaving me staring at the ceiling. I wasn't a mind reader, but I'd been a husband long enough to know when the air changes. You learn at my age that trouble doesn't always kick the door down. Sometimes it drifts in through a cracked window, polite and invisible, and by the time you notice the chill, it's already inside the walls. That's what it felt like, a coldness I couldn't explain, coming from the person who used to be my warmest place. I kept asking myself if I'd missed some sign in myself, some way I'd failed her. That kind of self-check comes with age, but it doesn't erase what your gut is telling you. The night that tipped things from uneasy to undeniable was a Thursday in late October. Rain had been falling steady since afternoon, the kind that turns the streetlights into smeared yellow halos. Linda said she was meeting her sister for dinner. That wasn't strange. What was strange was how dressed up she got for a casual dinner with someone she'd known her whole life. She left around 6. I stayed home, watched the weather, half listened to the ball game. By 9, the game was over, and she wasn't home. I texted, "Everything okay?" 10 minutes went by. Nothing. I called. It rang twice before going to voicemail. At 10 sharp, I heard her car pull in. I didn't storm to the door. I just stood in the hallway, waiting. She came in carrying her purse like it weighed a ton. Her hair was damp, but not from rain. Her cheeks were pink, and when she brushed past me, I caught a smell I hadn't smelled on her in 40 years. Men's cologne, sharp and expensive. I asked the question any husband would ask. "You all right? You said you were with Carol." She froze halfway to the stairs. "Frank," she said, without turning around, "if you love me, don't ask questions." I honestly thought I misheard her. Linda had never talked to me like that, not even in our worst fights. I said, "What do you mean?" She turned then, eyes hard in a way that didn't match her face. "I mean exactly what I said. I'm tired. Good night." She walked upstairs. The bedroom door clicked shut. I stood there holding nothing but that sentence. If you love me, don't ask questions. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed up like affection, and it landed on me like a shove. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink, and sat at the table staring at the wood grain. My heart wasn't racing. It was sinking. Love had never been a muzzle in our house. Love had always been the reason we spoke plainly, even when it hurt. Maybe she'd had a bad night. Maybe something happened with her sister. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the cologne smell clung to my shirt when I hugged her hello. She didn't hug back. And the way she shut me down felt practiced, like she'd said it before. That was the first time I felt fear in my own marriage. Not fear of her exactly. Fear of what I didn't know. Fear that the woman upstairs was carrying a life I wasn't part of. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay there, listening to the rain tap the window, wondering how long a man can be told not to ask questions before the questions start asking him. By dawn, I knew one thing. Silence might keep peace for a day, but it rots a man. The next morning, Linda acted as if nothing had happened. She hummed while frying eggs, talked about the neighbor's dog digging up her flower bed, and asked if I'd seen her blue sweater. I watched her move around the kitchen with a calmness that didn't match the way she'd spoken to me the night before. It was like she'd wiped the slate clean in her mind and expected me to do the same. I tried to mirror her tone, but something inside me wouldn't settle. That sentence kept replaying. If you love me, don't ask questions. I'd lived long enough to recognize the shape of manipulation when it was pressed into my hands. You don't get to use love as a shield against accountability, not after decades of marriage built on honesty. Later that afternoon, she left her phone on the countertop while she went to check the mail. It buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. Her phone never used to ring that much. I didn't touch it, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew crossing that line without reason would make me feel smaller. I wanted the truth, but I wanted it the right way. When she came back in and saw the notifications, she grabbed the phone quickly, pressing it against her chest as if I might lunge for it. I said gently, "Linda, is something wrong?" She sighed like I was a child bothering her. "Frank, please, don't start." "Start what?" She turned away from me, shaking her head. "If you love me, don't ask questions." She repeated it slower this time, like she was teaching me a lesson. "It will only cause problems." I stood there stunned. "But something is wrong," I said quietly. "Nothing is wrong," she replied sharply, "and I'm not going to argue." She walked out of the room, leaving me talking to an empty doorway. I went out to the garage, sat at my workbench, and stared at a screwdriver as though it might offer advice. My father used to say that when a person starts using love as leverage, they've already chosen their side, and it isn't yours. I felt that truth settling over me like dust. Love isn't supposed to be a gag order. Love doesn't fear questions. I thought about our years together, about the promises we made. I thought about how trust is built one brick at a time, but only takes one lie to crumble. And I realized something painful. If she was hiding something, she'd already decided I didn't deserve the truth. That was the moment a different kind of resolve began forming inside me. Not anger, not yet, but something sturdier, something colder. If she didn't want questions, then fine. I'd stop asking, but I'd start listening. And that was the first quiet step toward the decision that would change everything. Because love shouldn't require blindness, and a man deserves to know what world he's living in. The following evening, Linda announced she was going to bed early. She kissed my cheek, something she hadn't done in weeks, and climbed the stairs. I watched her walk away, sensing the shift again, some mix of guilt and calculation I couldn't quite name. When the bedroom door clicked shut, I felt that familiar tremor in my chest. The truth was close, too close to ignore. I sat alone in the living room, listening to the settling sounds of the house. After a long pause, I reached under the couch cushion and pulled out a small digital recorder I'd bought earlier that day. The kind mechanics use to take notes on the job. Nothing fancy, nothing illegal. Just a simple device that could tell me whether my instincts were lying. I wasn't proud of myself. I'm not the kind of man who snoops. But I also wasn't the kind of man who lets himself be gaslit into silence. If she refused questions, then this was the only path left. I placed the recorder beneath the cushion, where Linda usually sat when she used her phone. The fabric muffled it well. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I checked the battery, turned it on, and let the soft red light blink before tucking it in. That night, I barely slept. I listened to every sound the house made, trying to decipher if she was awake, talking, whispering. But the house stayed quiet. The next morning, Linda left early for her morning jog. I waited until her car pulled out of the driveway, then went to the living room and retrieved the recorder with trembling hands. I sat at my desk in the spare room and pressed play. At first, all I heard was television noise, an old sitcom rerun, muffled laughter. Then the sound cut out, followed by the unmistakable rustle of the couch cushions. Then her voice, soft, whispering, careful. I can't tonight. He's home. A pause. No, I told you. I know. I know. I miss you too. My blood turned cold. There was a faint, male voice on the other end, too quiet to decipher, but the tone was unmistakable, familiar, intimate in a way no phone call between friends should ever sound. She whispered again, "He keeps asking questions." Yes. I told him not to. My jaw clenched. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might drown out the recording. After that, the audio went silent. No names, no specifics. Just enough to confirm the worst possibility. I sat back in my chair, staring at the wall. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was the first real crack in the glass. A confirmation of my fear. A confirmation of her lies. And as I held that little recorder in my hand, I felt something shift inside me. Something that told me I wouldn't be walking away from this quietly. Not anymore. Over the next few weeks, my mornings took on a routine that Linda never noticed. She'd leave for her jog, or what she claimed was a jog, and I'd retrieve the recorder, listening carefully to whatever it captured the night before. Then I'd erase the audio, reset it, and hide it again before she returned. I wasn't looking for a confession. I wasn't even looking for closure. I just needed the truth, the real truth, the kind that didn't change depending on her mood or convenience. At first, the recordings were short, a few whispered phone calls, soft giggles, occasional fragments of sentences that twisted my stomach. Then things grew clearer, more frequent, more intimate. Same place? She'd whisper. Tomorrow again. Don't call me after 9. He's still awake. He's suspicious. Every word was a nail driven into the coffin of the life I thought I'd had. In between those nights, Linda's lies multiplied. She said her sister needed help downsizing her apartment. Yet her sister told me they hadn't seen each other in weeks. She claimed she'd joined a group fitness class, yet she never once mentioned the instructor or the location or the other women. She wore makeup on days she stayed home, but would tell me she just felt like brightening up. I stayed calm, steady, quiet. A lifetime of holding my temper served me well. I didn't accuse her. I didn't confront her. I simply watched. Betrayal isn't a single moment. It's a slow leak that drains the trust you thought was built to last. And I could feel it every day, like water pooling at my feet, rising, cold and unwelcome. One night, I sat alone in the garage, listening to a particularly revealing recording. Her voice was soft and warm in a way she hadn't spoken to me in months. No, he won't find out. He trusts me. I felt my hand curl into a fist, but I didn't slam the table or shout. I just breathed, slow and controlled, because the truth wasn't breaking me. It was hardening me. By the 5th week, a pattern had fully formed. Late-night calls, early morning outings, secret meetings, lies about lies, and the recordings consistently confirmed it. Every day I woke up, knowing a little more of the woman sleeping next to me, or maybe the woman she'd become while I wasn't looking. I realized each lie wasn't just covering something up, it was revealing something too, revealing who she trusted, revealing who she missed, revealing what she valued. And it wasn't me. That understanding didn't come with rage. It came with a steady, quiet resolve. A resolve to keep going, to keep listening, to find the whole truth, not the pieces she allowed me to see. Because once a man sees the pattern clearly, it stops being suspicion. It becomes reality. And reality, no matter how painful, is something I've always known how to face. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found at first. Shame is a quiet thing, and it sits heavy on a man's shoulders. But after weeks of listening to recordings and pretending everything was normal, I needed perspective, someone who wouldn't judge me, someone whose life had already taken its share of hard turns. So one Thursday afternoon, I drove over to see my old friend Howard. Howard's been a widower for 10 years. He's the kind of man who speaks only when it matters, the kind whose silence carries more weight than most people's speeches. We've known each other since the plant days, shared lunches in the break room, argued about baseball, and held each other up through layoffs and funerals. When I walked into his garage, he was sanding an old rocking chair. He gave me that slow nod of his, the one that says, "I see you, even if you don't say why you're here." "How's retirement treating you?" he asked. I shrugged. Some days good, some days quieter than I expected. He kept sanding, letting me work up to whatever I needed to say. That's how older men talk, sideways, slow, giving each other permission without forcing it. Finally, I said, "Howard, can I ask you something? Off the record?" He put the sandpaper down and leaned against the workbench. "You can ask me anything." I didn't tell him about the recordings. I didn't tell him about my suspicions outright. I just said, "If someone you loved started acting different, real different, what would you do?" He studied me with those clear gray eyes that have seen more truth than some people can stomach. After a long pause, he said, "A woman doesn't pull away for no reason. But the reason ain't always the one you fear." He folded his arms. "What matters is whether she lets you in when you ask." I breathed out slowly. "She doesn't. Not anymore." Howard nodded, like that told him everything he needed to know. "Then she's already answered you." I looked at the floor. "I don't want to jump to conclusions." "You're not," he said softly. "You're standing in the conclusion. You just don't want to name it yet." Those words hit deep. Not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He wiped his hands on a rag and added, "Frank, I've been married and I've buried a wife I loved. Trust me when I say this. The truth doesn't break a good marriage. Lies do." I felt something inside me shift. Not hope, not yet. Clarity, maybe, or the first breath after holding it for too long. When I left his house, the sky looked darker than when I'd arrived. But my mind felt steadier. Howard didn't give me answers. He gave me permission to keep looking for them. And that small bit of wisdom was enough to push me one step closer to the truth I was afraid to face. A few days after my talk with Howard, something new happened. Something that made my stomach drop the moment I saw it. Linda began locking the bottom drawer of her desk. Linda had never locked anything in her life. She kept important papers in a shoebox in the closet, jewelry in a dish on her nightstand, and spare cash in an envelope labeled "just in case." She wasn't secretive by nature. That drawer, though, it became her new habit. She'd open it only when she thought I was busy. And she always turned her body slightly, blocking my view. That drawer was a boundary. And boundaries don't just appear out of nowhere after 40 years of marriage. One afternoon, she said she was going to take a long shower. A stress shower, she called it. As soon as I heard the water turn on, I walked into the office and stood in front of the desk. It felt wrong, like crossing a line, but I kept thinking about Howard's words. The truth doesn't break a good marriage, lies do. And Linda had put this drawer between us, not me. I pulled out my old key ring from the desk nearby. Over the years, I'd kept random spare keys without labeling them. Mailbox, garden shed, old padlocks, a drawer from our first apartment. I tried one at a time, moving slowly, listening carefully. The fourth key clicked. My breath hitched. I opened the drawer. Inside was a collection of things that didn't belong together. Receipts for hotel bookings. 2 different hotels, all weekdays. A burner phone, the kind you buy cash only at a gas station. A piece of jewelry I had never seen her wear. A delicate necklace with a small silver charm. A folded note with a phone number and a heart drawn next to it. My hands shook, but not from anger. From the kind of realization that makes your bones go cold. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't stress or midlife confusion. This was a second life, nested inside the first like a parasite. I didn't take anything. I didn't photograph anything. I simply looked, memorized, and placed each item exactly where it had been. I slid the drawer shut, relocked it, and put the keys back. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the carpet, letting the truth settle like dust. When Linda came downstairs, I acted normal. She made tea, humming again, like everything was fine. But now I knew. I didn't have the full story yet, but I had crossed the line between suspicion and confirmation. The drawer wasn't just locked. Our marriage was. And I was finally on the other side of the truth. The breaking point didn't arrive with fireworks. It didn't even arrive with a fight. It came in the form of a small, everyday moment, one that shouldn't have mattered, but did. It was a Sunday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table balancing our budget, something I'd done every month since we got married. Linda came downstairs, tense and distracted. Her phone buzzed 3 times in less than a minute. She glanced at the screen, then flipped it face down, biting her lip. I didn't say anything. I'd learned to watch instead of ask. She opened a cabinet, grabbed the cereal, and poured herself a bowl. Then she turned around, pointed at my wallet sitting by the fruit bowl, and said sharply, "Can you not leave your things everywhere? I had to look for my keys for 10 minutes because that was in the way." It was such a small thing. My wallet was exactly where I always put it, and she had walked right past it 3 times that morning without issue. I stared at her, confused. "Linda, my wallet didn't move. It wasn't in your way." She snapped. "Why do you have to argue about everything?" I blinked slowly. Argue? I hadn't even raised my voice. And that's when it clicked. She needed me to be the problem. She needed to shift the weight away from her own guilt. Because guilt is heavy, and the easiest place to drop it is on the person closest to you. I said quietly, "I'm not arguing. I'm just asking." She rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath, and stormed out of the room. The slam of the door echoed through the house. I sat there in silence, staring at my wallet. The same object that had sat in the same place for years. A harmless thing, suddenly turned into a battlefield. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Not with anger, but with clarity. I stood up, went to the spare room, and opened the notebook where I'd been keeping notes from the recordings. That morning, I listened to every audio file again, from the first whisper to the last muffled giggle. I wrote down times, dates, words. My hands were steady as I worked, steady in a way they hadn't been in weeks. By the time I finished, the sun had shifted across the room, casting long shadows on the carpet. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't being unreasonable. I was right. And with that realization, fear quietly transformed into purpose. Because a man can hold a marriage together through a lot of storms, money troubles, sickness, grief. But no man, not one with dignity, can hold a marriage together alone while the other person tears it down in the dark. That was the day I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. It happened on a Tuesday evening, quiet, uneventful, the sort of evening where nothing should have changed. Linda went to bed early again, claiming a headache. I waited until her breathing settled into the slow rhythm of sleep before slipping out of the room with the recorder from the living room couch. I sat in the spare room, door cracked just enough to hear if she woke. I pressed play. At first, it was the usual, her voice soft and low, the tone I'd once thought she reserved only for me. But then something new slipped through the static. A name. Clear. Unmistakable. Mark. My whole body froze. I replayed it 3 times just to be sure. But it was there, her whisper dropping into my ears like ice water. Mark. I felt my heartbeat shift, slowing into something heavy and deliberate. Not panic, not shock. Something worse. Recognition. Because Mark wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some faceless man from work or a random acquaintance. Mark was our neighbor's son. He'd mowed our lawn during summers home from college. He'd helped me fix the porch railing 2 years back. He'd eaten burgers off my grill, thanked me for helping him get on his feet, and called me Mr. Dalton with that easy, respectful grin. He was 32 years old, young enough to be my son, young enough to be one of my kids' friends, and he was the one she'd been whispering to in the dark. The realization felt like a gut punch, not violent, just deep enough to knock the air out of me without making a sound. I sat there staring at the recorder like it had betrayed me personally. Why him? Why someone so close? Why someone who'd walked through my home like family? I kept listening. I needed more. The recording continued, her voice warming in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in months. Mark, I told you I'd see you tomorrow, don't worry. He won't know. My jaw clenched. My grip on the recorder tightened. He won't know. But I did know now. And knowledge has a way of changing a man, especially a man who has lived long enough to recognize when a line has been crossed so boldly it cannot be undone. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. Every memory of Mark helping around the yard replayed in my head with a bitter twist. Every handshake felt like a mockery now. Every smile felt like a deception I should have seen coming, though I had no reason to suspect him. It's a strange feeling, discovering that the threat wasn't some distant stranger, but someone you'd trusted, someone you'd welcomed, someone you'd vouched for. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I just sat there in the dim light of that room, letting the truth settle into my bones. The betrayal was no longer vague or confusing. It had a name, and that made it real in a way that shook the ground beneath my feet. Once I knew the name, everything in my world began shifting, even the ordinary moments. The following night, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. Linda stepping outside after dark. Around 10 p.m., she slipped on a jacket and said she needed fresh air. I nodded, keeping my face calm. But once she stepped out onto the porch, I moved quietly to the front window, flattening myself against the wall just out of view. The night was cold, the kind that carries sound well. I watched her stand in the driveway, arms crossed, eyes scanning the street. She wasn't looking at the stars. She wasn't enjoying the breeze. She was waiting. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The neighborhood was quiet. No dogs barking, no cars passing, just the stillness of a late-night suburban street. And then I heard it. The low rumble of a truck engine approaching slowly. My stomach tightened. The headlights turned the corner, sweeping across the houses. Then the truck crawled down our street, moving too slowly to be casual. Mark's truck. I recognized the dent in the front bumper, the faded decal on the back window, the way it rattled slightly when idling. He didn't stop. He didn't roll down the window. He just slowed as he passed our driveway. Linda stepped forward half a step, not enough to be obvious, but enough for me to see it, enough for me to know she was acknowledging him. My hands pressed into the window frame until my knuckles ached. But I didn't move. I didn't pull the curtain aside. I didn't give myself away. I watched. The truck rolled past, then picked up speed as it reached the end of the street and turned out of sight. The tail lights disappeared into the dark. Linda lingered in the driveway for another minute, staring down the road long after he was gone. Then she exhaled, a sigh of longing or disappointment, I couldn't tell, and walked back inside. By the time she closed the door, I was sitting on the couch pretending to watch TV. She glanced at me briefly, her expression calm, almost detached, like the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. "Cold out," she said. "Yeah," I replied. She walked upstairs without another word. I sat there, feeling the weight of the truth settle deeper. It wasn't just phone calls or secret drawers anymore. It wasn't just whispers on recordings. It was physical, observable, real. She hadn't just drifted away. She was meeting someone halfway. And that someone was a man who had walked through my yard, slept in the house next door, and probably waved at me while betraying me behind my back. There's a unique kind of heartbreak in watching your own life from the outside, seeing it with the clarity of a man who has finally opened his eyes. That night, I learned something important. Silence doesn't just reveal truth. It protects it long enough for you to understand what needs to be done. The final confirmation came on a morning that began like any other, quiet, unremarkable, almost peaceful. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when Linda's phone buzzed on the counter beside the sink. "Mind grabbing that?" she called from upstairs. I reached for the phone without thinking. It buzzed again, then again. Before I could check the screen, the call ended. A moment later, it rang once more, but this time I saw what was different. Her phone was calling me. I frowned. Maybe she butt-dialed me from upstairs. I answered. "Yeah, Lynn." But what I heard wasn't my wife calling for help or reminding me to defrost something for dinner. I heard her whisper, soft, warm, intimate. "I miss you already." My heart slammed into my ribs. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The world seemed to still around me. The refrigerator hum, the ticking wall clock, even my own breathing. She spoke again. "I'll see you later, I promise." A pause. Then her tone changed. The sudden realization that the person on the other end wasn't who she thought it was. "Frank?" Her voice cracked on my name. I finally managed to say, "Linda." There was a long silence, longer than any we had shared in months. Then the line went dead. She hung up. Seconds later, I heard hurried footsteps upstairs, followed by the frantic closing of a door. I sat there at the table, staring at the phone in my hand. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't feel it. I didn't feel anything except a quiet, steady certainty. The truth had finally spoken for itself. There was no misinterpretation, no ambiguity, No room for excuses or misunderstandings. She hadn't called me. She'd called him. And those weren't words you say to a friend. When Linda eventually came downstairs, her face was pale. Her hair was disheveled in a way that didn't look like morning softness. It looked like panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Not even a lie. She just stood there, gripping the railing like it was the only thing holding her upright. I didn't ask her anything. I didn't demand answers. I simply stood, placed her phone gently on the kitchen island, and walked past her toward the living room. She whispered, "Frank, please." But I didn't turn around, because that moment, that call, had cut the last thread of doubt. I'd spent weeks following clues, collecting evidence, piecing together every whisper and lie. But this was the truth, delivered straight into my hands, unfiltered and undeniable. She hadn't said my name by mistake. She had said his, and that told me everything I needed to know. The day after Linda's mistaken phone call, I woke before sunrise. Not because of nerves, not because of anger, but because something inside me had shifted into place. I'd spent weeks moving through fog, but now the air was clear. When a man reaches a certain age, clarity becomes a rare and valuable thing. You don't waste it. You use it. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a blank binder in front of me. A simple black binder with empty plastic sleeves. Nothing fancy. Nothing emotional. Just a vessel for truth. I took a deep breath and began. I printed transcripts of the recordings, every whisper, every coded phrase, every moment she thought I wasn't listening. I labeled each with dates, times, and notes. Then I added the receipts I had memorized from her locked drawer. I recreated them from our credit card statements and online banking records. Hotel names, check-in times, transaction amounts. Each page went into the binder in order, forming a timeline so clear even a stranger could follow it. Next, I wrote down the nights she left the house for her runs, matching them to Mark's recorded visits to our street. I included the exact date she first told me not to ask questions. And finally, I wrote a simple one-page summary at the front. A calm, unflinching explanation of why I began recording at all. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I wrote in plain language, the way an honest man speaks. When I finished, the binder felt heavier than it should have. Not physically, emotionally. Every page was a small betrayal, and together, they formed the story of a marriage that had been decaying in the shadows while I was trying to keep the lights on. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Deep down, tired. The kind of tired that settles in your bones after you've spent too many nights pretending you don't know what you know. Some men would confront with shouting, with slamming doors, with rage hot enough to burn the house down. I wasn't one of those men. I'd learned from a lifetime of hard days and quiet dignity that anger doesn't give you control. It takes it away. So I chose calm. I chose preparation. I chose truth. This wasn't about winning. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't even about punishing her. It was about giving myself something I hadn't had in months. Certainty. The binder wasn't a weapon. It was protection. Protection against her denial. Protection against manipulation. Protection against my own heart trying to make excuses. And once I closed it and placed it gently on the table, I knew what had to come next. The truth wasn't going to stay in the dark anymore. I was going to bring it into the room with us. And this time, she wouldn't be able to walk away from it. The next morning, Linda came downstairs with the same forced smile she'd worn for months. She asked if I wanted eggs or oatmeal. I told her oatmeal was fine. My voice sounded normal, even to me. You learn, over years of living, how to keep your face steady even when your heart feels like shifting earth. She cooked quietly, humming under her breath. A soft melody, something nostalgic from the radio station she liked. I watched her move around the kitchen like she had so many mornings before. The sunlight filtered through the window, warming her shoulder. It struck me how normal the moment looked, how fragile normalcy really is. When she placed the bowl in front of me, she sat across the table instead of her usual spot by the window. She stirred her coffee, eyes drifting toward her phone more than toward me. I wondered how many breakfasts she'd spent mentally elsewhere, how long she'd been splitting her life between the man across from her and the man waiting in the shadows. But I didn't let those thoughts rise. I simply watched, observed, absorbed. She asked about my plans for the day. I said I might work in the garage. She nodded, but her mind was clearly distant. Her fingers drummed the table. Her foot tapped restlessly beneath her chair. Guilt, I've learned, has a rhythm. At one point, she looked up and said softly, "You seem quiet these days." I held her gaze. "We both are." She blinked, startled by the honesty. But she didn't ask more. She didn't press. She just looked back down at her oatmeal. And in that moment, I felt a bittersweet sadness wash over me. This woman had shared nearly every chapter of my adult life. We'd raised children together. We'd survived hardships. We'd laughed over burned dinners, argued over bills, sat beside each other at funerals. And now we were sitting at the same table, but living in different worlds. I watched her hands, steady, practiced, familiar. The same hands that once held mine under the dinner table at holidays. The same hands that soothed our children when they cried. And now those hands were trembling ever so slightly around the handle of her spoon. She knew something was unraveling. She didn't know how much I knew, but she felt the shift in the air, the quiet before a storm neither of us could avoid. It struck me then how strange it is that the last peaceful moment of a marriage feels so ordinary, not dramatic, not loud, just fragile. Halfway through the meal, Linda reached across the table as if to touch my hand, then pulled back before she made contact, an instinctive gesture interrupted by guilt. We finished breakfast in silence. When she stood to gather the dishes, I realized that this quiet, fragile moment would be the last time we shared a meal without truth sitting between us. Soon, the storm would break, and there would be no going back. Later that afternoon, after Linda had left for her usual errands, I stood in the living room and looked around the space where our confrontation would take place. It had seen birthdays, holidays, late-night movies with the kids, and years of shared evenings that used to feel comforting. But today, it felt like a stage for truth. I closed the blinds, not because I was hiding anything, but because I didn't want neighbors passing by and catching glimpses of something personal and painful. I turned off the television. I straightened the furniture. I cleared the coffee table. I wanted nothing to distract from what needed to be said and what needed to be heard. The binder sat in the center of the table, closed, neat, unassuming. It looked harmless, but inside it was the complete story of her betrayal, documented with calm precision. Hard facts, irrefutable details, no room for distortions. I set my phone on the side table and opened the recording app, not to catch her in more lies, but to protect myself. I'd learned that clarity matters, especially when emotions get loud. Everything needed to be recorded, not for revenge, but for truth. Then I sat in my usual spot on the couch, hands resting calmly on my knees. I practiced breathing evenly, preparing myself not to yell or shake or break down. Dignity had to lead the way. If I lost control, the truth would scatter like loose papers in a storm. When Linda's car pulled into the driveway, my pulse quickened for just a moment. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. Then I steadied myself. She walked through the front door, juggling grocery bags and her purse. "You're home early," she said, sounding surprised. Her smile flickered when she noticed the blinds closed and the TV off. "Can we talk?" I asked. Something in my tone must have struck her, because she set the bags down slowly. Her eyes darted toward the binder, then back to my face. Her posture stiffened. "What's this about, Frank?" "Have a seat," I said gently. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the armchair across from me. The space between us felt wider than it ever had in our entire marriage. I let a long moment of quiet settle before speaking again. Not to intimidate her, just to create space for truth to breathe. "I think it's time," I began, "for us to talk openly, completely. No more half answers, no more shutting down questions." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Frank," I raised a hand gently. "Not yet. I want you to listen first." She tensed, shoulders rising like shields. And then, with a steadiness I didn't know I still possessed, I reached for the binder and placed it between us on the table. The moment had come, not for anger, not for revenge, but for truth. The stage was set, and neither of us could walk away from it now. Linda stared at the binder as if it were a live wire. Her fingers curled around the edges of the armchair, knuckles whitening. I could see her pulse racing in the hollow of her neck. A lifetime with someone teaches you how to read even their smallest reactions, and right then, her body spoke louder than any words she might try to produce. I didn't open the binder yet. I wanted to give her one. Not an escape, but a chance. A chance to tell the truth with her own mouth before I showed her the truth I had gathered. "Linda," I began softly, "I need you to listen, and I need you to be honest. Completely honest." She shook her head once, fast, instinctive. "Frank, I don't know what you think." "Don't," I said quietly. "Not yet. Just hear me." The steadiness in my voice surprised even me. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't angry. I felt something closer to acceptance, as though my heart had already made peace with what my mind was about to walk through. I opened the binder. The first page was dated transcripts of her phone, calls, every whisper, every coded comment, every moment she believed she was safe in secrecy. I didn't speak. I simply turned on the small speaker beside me and pressed play. Her voice filled the room. "So tomorrow? Same time?" She flinched, her breath caught. Her eyes flickered toward the door like she wanted to run. I pressed pause. "Should I keep going?" I asked. She swallowed hard. "Frank, I pressed play again. "I miss you too. He's asleep." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She pressed her lips together, shaking her head as if denying the reality right in front of her. But denial is a weak shield when the truth plays back in your own voice. I turned off the speaker. "You said if I loved you, not to ask questions," I said softly. So I stopped asking. I tapped the binder, and I started confirming. She covered her mouth with trembling hands. "I never meant to, Frank. I wasn't. This isn't." "It is," I said calmly. "And you know it is." Her shoulders slumped, collapsing under the weight of her own choices. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I didn't accuse. I simply presented the truth in its purest form, because truth doesn't need theatrics. It stands strong on its own. She finally managed, "Frank, Please, I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I said, my voice steady. Not with one moment, with dozens, with whispers, with lies, with secrets you built in the dark. A long silence filled the room. She looked at me with eyes filled with fear. Not fear of me, but fear of accountability, fear of losing the life she had taken for granted, fear of seeing herself clearly for the first time. When I pressed play, I said quietly, I needed you to hear what I've lived with for weeks, because this isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't stress or confusion or loneliness. I closed the binder gently. This is betrayal, Linda. And for the first time, she didn't deny it. She simply lowered her head and cried. When the recording ended, the room fell into a heavy stillness. Linda wiped her eyes with shaking fingers, struggling to form words. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The excuses were already gathering behind her lips, trembling like fragile glass. I was lonely, she whispered. I sat back in my chair, hands folded in my lap, letting her speak. You were always in the garage or watching the news or tired. I felt invisible. Her voice cracked. I never meant for anything to happen, it just did. I didn't respond. Silence is a language of its own. One older man speaks fluently. She continued, her words tumbling out in uneven bursts. He made me feel wanted, like I mattered. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think it would hurt you. I wasn't thinking about anything except feeling something again. Another silence. Heavy. Thick. She leaned forward, desperate now. Frank, it wasn't serious. I swear. He wasn't. I raised my hand slightly. Linda, stop. She froze mid-sentence. You don't have to lie anymore. Her lower lip trembled. Her shoulders sagged. She looked younger somehow, smaller, like guilt had stripped 20 years from her spine. You think I don't see it? I asked quietly. The excuses, the rehearsed explanations, the story you've been planning if I ever caught on. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but I didn't reach for her. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because that instinct to comfort her had been burned out of me. When you say you were lonely, I continued, you make it sound like I pushed you into someone else's arms. I didn't. I gestured around the room. We built this life together, and you stepped out of it, not because of anything I did or didn't do. She covered her face, crying harder now. Frank, please understand. I didn't want. You wanted what you wanted, I said, and you didn't care how it would land, not until you were caught. She shook her head violently, as if she could shake the truth out of the air, but truths don't evaporate. I gestured to the binder. This is weeks of lies, not a momentary lapse, not a stumble, a pattern. She looked up, eyes red and glassy. I'm sorry. I nodded once. I know you're sorry, but not for the reason that matters. She flinched like I'd struck her. You're sorry it came to light, I said softly. You're sorry you didn't hide it better. You're sorry the secret unraveled, but sorry for the betrayal itself. I shook my head. No, you don't get to hide behind sorry. For the first time since we'd sat down, she didn't speak. Not a word. And in that silence, I finally understood. Her excuses weren't meant to heal anything. They were meant to save herself from the truth she'd spent months avoiding. And no amount of crying could repair what she had willingly broken. She sat there breathing shakily, tears streaking her face, her hands twisting in her lap like she was trying to wring guilt out of her own skin. I watched her for a long moment. not with anger, but with a kind of tired sadness I can't quite describe. A sadness that comes from realizing the person you shared your life with chose a different path while you were still walking the original one. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Linda," I said quietly, "I'm going to ask you one thing, just one, and I want the truth." She looked up at me with swollen eyes, nodding. I took a slow, steady breath. Was it worth our marriage? The question hit her harder than anything I'd said before. Her face crumpled, her body folded inward, like she was trying to disappear into the chair. She opened her mouth, but the answer didn't come. No excuses, no explanations, no rehearsed lines, just silence, a silence that spoke the truth. She refused to say out loud. I nodded, the realization settling into me like a final puzzle piece. That's all I needed to know. She reached toward me, desperate. "Frank, please, I can fix this. I'll do anything. I'll cut things off. It's already cut," I said gently. "But not in the way you're thinking." She stared at me with the wide, helpless eyes of someone watching something slip away that they never expected to lose. I stood slowly. My knees ached the way a 68-year-old man's knees tend to. I closed the binder, not with finality, but with care, like placing a gravestone over something that had died a long time ago. "I need time," I said. "Time to breathe, time to think, time to remember who I am when I'm not being lied to." She stood too, shaky and frantic. "Frank, don't leave, please, don't do this." I looked at her calmly, and she didn't understand. "I'm not leaving in anger," I said. "I'm leaving in clarity." She sobbed. "I'll change. I promise. I'll do better." "That's not what this is about anymore." She reached for my arm, but I stepped back, not abruptly, just firmly. A boundary drawn not out of cruelty, but necessity. I walked toward the door. "Frank," she whispered, "please don't go." My hand rested on the doorknob. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle into my bones. Then I said the words I'd been carrying in my chest ever since she whispered another man's name. Her silence told me everything her lies never could. And then I opened the door and walked out, not as a man running away, but as a man choosing what little dignity he still had left. I stayed at Howard's place for 2 nights after the confrontation. He didn't ask many questions, just set out a spare blanket, left a glass of water by the nightstand, and told me to rest. Older men know when to let another man sit with his grief. No pressure, no fixing, just space. On the 3rd day, I drove back home. As I stepped through the front door, something struck me immediately. The house felt off, not different in appearance, not rearranged, just hollow in a way I couldn't ignore. That house had been my home for decades, filled with the echoes of laughter, arguments, holidays, burnt dinner attempts, and whispered goodnights. But now, it felt like walking into a museum of a life I no longer belonged to. Linda was sitting at the kitchen table, hands clasped, waiting. Her eyes were swollen, her expression heavy with the same dread I'd been carrying for weeks. She didn't speak at first, just watched me, as if hoping I'd bring in some sense of normalcy with me. "Did you sleep anywhere at all?" she asked quietly. "I slept," I lied. She nodded but didn't push. I walked through the house slowly, room by room. Each space held memories, but the memories felt altered now, colored by betrayal, shaped by the knowledge of what had been happening behind my back. The couch where we'd watched movies, the hallway where we hung our kids' school photos, the bedroom where she whispered to another man while I slept. Everything was the same, but nothing was familiar. Linda followed me through the house at a distance, like a shadow that didn't know where to land. She tried speaking a few times, small phrases like, "Can we talk?" or "I want to explain." But the words hung heavy in the air and died before reaching me. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. I sat down in my recliner, the one piece of furniture that had molded to my shape over the years. She sat across from me, hands folded like a child waiting for a verdict. "Frank," she whispered, "I never wanted this." I looked at her calmly, but it happened. Her eyes filled again with tears. "I don't know how to fix this." I nodded slowly. "Some things aren't meant to be fixed. Not the way you're thinking." Silence settled between us, heavy, suffocating, but necessary. The kind of silence only two people who've shared a long life can really feel. In that silence, I understood something important. Betrayal doesn't destroy a home in one moment. It erodes it, slowly, quietly. And by the time you recognize the cracks, the foundation has already shifted. The house hadn't changed, but I had. And now, it wasn't home anymore. Over the next week, Linda tried talking to me more than she had in years. She'd follow me from room to room, gently, cautiously, like approaching a wild animal she feared might bolt or bite. But I wasn't angry in those moments. I wasn't anything, really. Just tired. One night after dinner, if you could call it dinner, we mostly picked at food without eating, she finally mustered enough courage to speak clearly. "Frank," she said softly, "I want to try counseling." I looked at her across the table. "Why?" "To fix this," she said quickly, "to understand why things happened the way they did." I shook my head. "I understand why they happened." She inhaled sharply. "Then tell me." "You chose it," I said simply. She flinched. "I was lonely." I shrugged gently. "People get lonely. They talk. They ask for what they need. They don't do what you did." Her eyes glistened. I was broken. "Then you should have told me," I replied calmly. "Broken things can be repaired. Hidden things can't." She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together. "I know I hurt you. I know I've destroyed something real. But we have decades together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I took a deep breath. "It means everything to me. But you don't measure a marriage by its length. You measure it by the truth inside it." She began to cry quietly. That soft, trembling kind of crying that makes you feel a mixture of pity and distance. I watched her, not coldly, but with the kind of emotional detachment that comes when you've been wounded too deeply to bleed anymore. She whispered, "I'm willing to do anything." "I know," I said. "But willingness doesn't erase what happened." She reached across the table, but I didn't move. Her fingers brushed the air between us, empty, suspended. "Do you still love me?" she asked, voice cracking. I closed my eyes. That question, simple, sharp, hit me harder than all the evidence, all the recordings, all the lies. After a long moment, I said, "I love who you were. I love the woman I thought you were. But the woman you've been these months, I don't know her." She sobbed openly then, loud, heartbreaking, desperate. I didn't reach out, not because I didn't care, because I finally understood something. It takes two honest people to rebuild trust, and only one of us had been honest. That night, as I lay awake in bed, staring into the darkness, I realized that the conversations weren't bringing us closer. They were showing me just how far apart we already were. and that realization carried its own kind of grief. A quieter kind, a deeper kind, the kind that tells a man his next decision will define the rest of his life. It was a Wednesday evening when I made the final decision. No dramatic moment pushed me there, no new evidence, no fresh betrayal. Just a quiet realization that washed over me like the steady hum of an engine. That calm, deep certainty older men reach when emotion has finally burned itself out. Linda had gone to bed early. I sat alone in the living room, the lamp casting a soft circle of light over the coffee table. The binder rested there silently, like a closed chapter. I hadn't opened it in days. I didn't need to. I knew every page by heart now. After a long moment, I stood and walked out to the truck. The night air was crisp, almost cleansing. I sat behind the wheel, hands resting on the steering column, and clicked through the folder on my phone where the recordings were stored. I played one, not to wound myself, but to remind myself. Her voice floated through the speakers. "I can't tonight. He's home." I stopped the recording. I closed my eyes and let the truth settle in my chest, not as pain, but as clarity. She hadn't slipped, she hadn't stumbled. She had chosen, and choices have consequences, even when they come wrapped in regret. I sat there for a long time, engine off, listening to the quiet of the neighborhood. Lights flickered in nearby houses. A dog barked in the distance. A train horn sounded far off toward the edge of town. Normal sounds of normal lives, lives built on truths, on routines, on trust. It hit me then that I could stay in that house for years and still never feel at home again. I could listen to 1,000 apologies and still never hear honesty beneath them. I could share a table with her every morning and still feel like a stranger eating beside a stranger. Some things heal, some things mend, but some things, trust, dignity, self-respect, once cracked, cannot return to their original shape. I opened my eyes and whispered to myself, "It's time." Not out of bitterness, not out of spite, but out of acceptance. The next morning, I met with an attorney. Not for divorce, not yet, but for separation, a space, a pause, a boundary strong enough for me to breathe again. When I returned home, Linda was in the kitchen. She turned to me with a hopeful smile that faded the moment she saw my face. "What happened?" she asked. I set the papers on the table. "I need distance," I said quietly. "I need to find myself again." Her face crumpled. She reached for the papers with shaking hands. "Frank, please." I stepped back. "I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this to save whatever dignity I still have left." Tears spilled down her cheeks. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I packed a small bag and walked out the door. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't fighting for what he built, but walking away from what someone else destroyed. I didn't plan to confront Mark at first. I thought distance and silence would be enough, that removing myself from the situation would close the chapter cleanly. But some truths don't settle until they're spoken aloud, face to face. And the longer I stayed away from home, the more I realized there was one thing left unfinished. Not vengeance, not punishment, just clarity. A week after I left the house, I drove to the workshop where Mark did automotive detailing. His truck was parked outside, the same one I'd seen creeping past my house at night, the same one whose headlights had cast whispers across my marriage. He looked up when I walked in. The color drained from his face like a tide pulling out. "Mr. Dalton," he said quietly. I didn't yell. I didn't rush toward him. I simply stood in front of him, hands at my sides, calm, controlled. Older men know that power isn't in raising your voice. It's in not needing to. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry. I didn't, I never meant, I cut him off gently. Don't insult either of us with lies. He closed his mouth. For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us taut as steel wire. You knew she was my wife, I said finally. My voice didn't tremble. It was steady, grounded, lived in. He nodded slowly, shame dragging his gaze downward. You came into my home, I continued. You ate at my table. You shook my hand. And all the while, I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. Some truths hang heavier when left unspoken. Mark opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand. I don't want excuses. I don't want explanations. I didn't come here for that. He stood rigid, waiting for the blow he assumed was coming. But I wasn't here to swing anything. I took one small step closer. Listen carefully. You will stay away from me, from my property, from anything that belongs to my life. You will not contact Linda. You will not drive past the house. You will not speak my name. He nodded frantically. I understand. Good, I said, because this isn't a threat. It's a boundary. Silence again. His eyes glistened with shame, or maybe fear. Hard to tell. Not my concern anymore. As far as I'm concerned, I said slowly, this conversation is the end of whatever you thought this was. He exhaled shakily, relieved that I wasn't throwing punches. He'd expected rage, maybe violence, but I wasn't there to satisfy his expectations. I gave him one final look, a look that said far more than words ever could. I'm leaving now, I said, and you won't see me again. Make sure the feeling is mutual. Then I turned and walked out. My steps were steady. My heart was calm, because sometimes the strongest justice a man can deliver is simply walking away with his dignity intact and forcing the other person to face what they've done without a single place to hide. I never intended for the neighborhood to find out. I didn't spread rumors, didn't hint at the truth, didn't say a word to anyone outside of Howard and eventually my daughter. I wasn't interested in spectacle. Betrayal already has enough noise without a man adding more to it. But small towns have a way of learning what no one says. A week after confronting Mark, I drove back to the old neighborhood to pick up some tools I'd left in the garage. As I pulled onto our street, I noticed something subtle but unmistakable. People were behaving differently. Mrs. Porter, who always waved cheerfully, paused mid-wave as she recognized my truck, her expression softening into something like sympathy. Two neighbors across the street whispered to each other, glancing back at Linda's house. And Mark's father, who'd always greeted me with a firm handshake, stood stiffly in his driveway, staring at the ground. I didn't approach him. He looked as heartbroken as I felt. Inside the house, Linda was sitting on the couch, small and quiet. Her eyes flicked toward the window occasionally, as though she felt the weight of the neighborhood's gaze. They know, she whispered when I walked in. I didn't tell them, I said truthfully. I know, she replied. I told one person. Just one. And now... She trailed off, burying her face in her hands. I sat across from her, watching her shoulders tremble. There was no satisfaction in seeing her world collapse. No victory. It was just sad. Sad the way a broken promise is sad, the way a dying garden is sad, the way something that once had life now lay wilted. Outside, Mark's truck drove by, fast, too fast, not slow and creeping like before. No hesitation, no lingering. He didn't look toward the house. He didn't dare. People on the sidewalk turned their faces away from him. Consequences. Not revenge, not rage, just the natural gravity of truth finally coming to light. Later that afternoon, Howard stopped by to check on me. He and I stood on the porch, not saying much, watching neighbors pass by. Some offered a nod, some offered a look of quiet understanding. Nobody pried. Older communities understand when a man is carrying something heavy. Howard said softly, "Truth has a way of walking on its own legs." I nodded. He added, "And the people who built their lives on lies trip over it sooner or later." I didn't respond, but the words settled inside me. Walking back into the house, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because people knew, but because the truth no longer lived only in my chest. The weight was shared now, not by choice, but by circumstance. And sometimes that's all the justice a man needs. The world sees what was done, and the ones responsible must live in that light. The decision to leave permanently didn't strike like lightning. It settled like fog. Gradually, quietly, until the world around me looked different and staying no longer made sense. I had been living with Howard for nearly a month when I drove back one last time to gather the last of my things. The house was silent when I arrived. Linda sat at the dining table with a pen in her hand and a stack of papers beside her. Separation papers. Her hand trembled slightly as she pushed them forward. "I signed," she whispered. "I didn't want to, but I did." I nodded, not out of relief or triumph, but respect. A small acknowledgement of a difficult thing done without theatrics. She looked at me with eyes that were tired and older than they'd been weeks earlier. "I know I broke everything," she said softly. "I know there's no fixing it, but I want you to know. I'm sorry, truly." For the first time since the confrontation, her apology felt real, not for being caught, not for consequences, but for the damage itself. I sighed, a long, heavy sigh that carried 40 years of shared life. "I know," I said, "but sorry doesn't always make things whole again." Tears welled, but she didn't cry openly. She held herself together, maybe for me, maybe for dignity, maybe both. I walked through the house one last time, my footsteps echoing in rooms that felt like ghosts. Our bedroom, with the imprint of my absence still visible. The living room couch where we once spent evenings laughing. The photos on the wall, frozen moments from a life that now felt like someone else's memory. At the doorway, I paused. Linda stood behind me, arms wrapped around herself. "I hope you find peace," she said. I nodded, my hand resting on the doorframe. "I already am." She closed her eyes and I walked out, not quickly, not slowly, but with purpose. My truck was packed, clothes, tools, my father's old watch, the photo albums our daughter had copied for me, a few books, and my woodworking tools. Enough to build a small life somewhere new. I drove across town to a small rental home I'd secured. It wasn't much, 1 bedroom, modest kitchen, a small yard. But it was mine. Quiet. Untouched by betrayal. A place where I could breathe without wondering what lies lived in the walls. I carried my bags inside, set them down, and stood in the center of the empty living room, listening to the stillness. Peace, not loud or triumphant, gentle, earned. Later that night, as I sat in my recliner with a cup of hot tea, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't lost. I wasn't broken. I wasn't defeated. I was free. And as I looked at the quiet room around me, I realized something profound. I didn't lose a marriage. I gained myself back. Moving into that small rental home felt like stepping out of a dense forest and finally seeing daylight again. Nothing fancy. Nothing modern. A simple 1-story place with creaking floors and a porch just big enough for a chair. But it was mine. Every inch of it. Untainted, unshadowed, unshared. And in the quiet mornings, That meant more than I could put into words. The first few days, I woke early out of habit. My body still expected Linda's footsteps, her coffee mug clinking, her soft morning humming. But the house was silent, except for the old heater rattling to life. At first, the silence felt too big, like a room with missing furniture. Then, slowly, it began to feel like peace. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch each morning, watching the sun stretch across the grass. No tension, no second guessing, no wondering where she was or who she was texting. Just the quiet company of my own thoughts. I picked up old habits I had forgotten I loved. Woodworking, for one. I set up a small workbench in the garage, pulled out hammers and chisels coated in nostalgia, and let my hands remember what to do. There's something healing about shaping raw wood, taking something rough and turning it into something useful. It reminded me that life, too, could be reshaped. I took daily walks around the neighborhood. Not far, just enough to stretch my legs and breathe in fresh air. Some neighbors nodded politely. Some stopped to chat. None asked questions they didn't need to ask. People sense when a man is rebuilding quietly. They step respectfully around the pieces. Meals became simple but peaceful. I cooked what I liked, nothing fancy but honest food. I cleaned up without tension simmering under the surface. I slept without waiting for a door to open or close at odd hours. The absence of suspicion felt like a weight lifted off my chest. Little by little, I remembered who I was before betrayal carved its marks into my heart. A man who enjoyed a good book in the evenings, a man who liked fixing things, a man who found comfort in routine, a man who didn't need noise or chaos to feel alive. Healing didn't happen in a dramatic rush. It came in tiny moments, sanding a piece of oak, sipping coffee alone, organizing tools, standing in the quiet and realizing my heartbeat no longer felt heavy. Peace doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives in steady breaths. And for the first time in months, I could breathe again. It took me a little while to tell my daughter everything. She knew something was wrong. That much was obvious in my voice the first time I called her after leaving home. But she didn't push. She just said, "Dad, whenever you're ready." That patience was something she got from her mother. How ironic life can be. A week after settling into the rental, I invited her over. She arrived with a bag of groceries, a worried smile, and her youngest son tugging at her hand. The moment she stepped inside, she looked around the modest home, taking in the simplicity, the quiet, the newness. Then she hugged me longer than she had in years. We sat at the kitchen table while the little one played with wooden blocks on the floor. She waited until I found my words. When I finally told her everything, gently, calmly, without bitterness, her face changed, not into anger, not into shock, into something deeper, recognition, understanding, protective sorrow. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, covering my hand with hers. "I'm so sorry." I shook my head. "I don't want you to be sorry. I just want you to know." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I knew something was wrong when you stopped sounding like yourself." We talked for hours, not about blame, not about revenge, just about truth, resilience, and the strange ways life can twist even after decades of seeming stability. She didn't judge her mother harshly, but she didn't excuse her either. She held both truths at once. A kindness I didn't expect, but deeply appreciated. After that day, the visits increased. She'd stop by with the kids on weekends. We'd sit on the porch while the little ones ran around the yard. Their laughter filled the space with warmth I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. My son called more often too, from out of state. He didn't say much. Men often don't. But he made sure I knew he was there. His quiet check-ins meant more than long speeches ever could. Slowly, my life brightened in unexpected ways. Family dinners at my daughter's house became a new routine. Holidays felt lighter, more authentic, somehow. No pretending, no forced smiles, no hidden tension humming beneath the surface. One evening, as my grandchildren crawled onto my lap and asked me to read them a story, I felt something shift inside me, something I hadn't felt in months. A sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of being surrounded by people who loved me without secrets. My daughter hugged me before I left that night, resting her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was little. She said softly, "Dad, I'm proud of you." And it struck me then. Sometimes the healing we need doesn't come from the person who hurt us, but from the people who never stopped loving us. It's strange how quiet life can become after the storm passes. Not empty, not lonely, just calm. The kind of calm you feel deep in your bones, like a gentle evening breeze that reminds you the worst is behind you. A few weeks after reconnecting with my family, I found myself sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip low. The sky stretched out in warm shades of orange and purple. The kind of sunset you only notice when your mind stops racing long enough to appreciate it. I thought about everything I'd been through, the lies, the recordings, the confrontation, the separation. I didn't feel anger anymore, not even sadness. What I felt was acceptance, quiet, steady, true. I realized something that night. Betrayal didn't end my life. It redirected it. It pushed me toward a version of myself I hadn't seen in years, a man who valued peace over paralysis, dignity over desperation, self-respect over staying where he wasn't honored. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The world felt wider now, not limited to the walls of a strained marriage or the weight of unanswered questions. I had room again, room to grow, to reflect, to simply be. Some evenings I'd work on a new project in the garage, a small bookshelf for my daughter's kids, a carved keepsake box, a set of coasters made from reclaimed oak. My hands stayed busy, but my mind stayed clear. Other nights, I'd sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea and watch the street, listening to the quiet rhythms of the neighborhood. No tension, no secrets, just the hum of cicadas and the occasional passing car. I didn't wonder what Linda was doing anymore. I didn't replay the recordings or dwell on the questions that once consumed me. The past had happened, and that was enough. I didn't owe it my present. Sometimes healing isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the simple act of waking up and realizing your chest doesn't feel tight anymore, that you're not bracing for the next lie, that you're no longer living in a world where trust is a fragile thing. One afternoon, my daughter asked if I ever regretted recording Linda. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I didn't do it to punish her. I did it so I could stop lying to myself." The truth didn't break me. It freed me. And the more distance I put between myself and the shadows of my old life, the brighter the road ahead became. I've lived long enough to know that life never promises fairness, but it does offer wisdom if you're willing to listen. And I've learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from punishment or revenge. It comes from reclaiming your peace. As the last light faded from the sky, I whispered to myself, I made it out, not with hatred, not with bitterness, but with truth. And with that truth came a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. A new kind of peace, one I intended to carry for the rest of my life.